Many of you at this stage are probably aware of the Japanese gardens, the Lafcadio Hearn Gardens in the middle of Tramore. It's been running a few years now. It was, I suppose, a labour of love for many, many people who wanted to honour Lafcadio Hearn, who spent his childhood summers in Tramore and ended up being a very, very renowned writer of Japanese folklore. There's a lovely event which we're about to talk about happening this coming Friday, the 14th of June at 2:00 in the gardens, and that is the launch of Sayonara, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Agnes?
Yes, it can be Sayonara or Sayonara, but I think you've got it right.
All right, I always get a bit of a fright when I say a word I'm not sure about how to pronounce. Agnes Aylward, you are the director of the Lafcadio Hearn Japanese Gardens. Now, my intro was a bit of a mouthful. For people who are not familiar with these beautiful gardens in Tramore, this is something you worked on with many people for many years.
We approached the council. I went to Tramore Development Trust. A group was formed. We went to the council. The council backed us, and the council leased the land to the trust, and a whole long saga started then to find funding, to find a designer, to find a storyline. But the storyline of the gardens is actually the thing that makes it work. And the storyline is the whole life of Lafcadio Hearn. His people can go and do a voyage of discovery, read his life through the garden. We have 10 sections. Each one of them is dedicated to a period of his life. So they'll find out about his infancy, his childhood in Ireland, including Tramore, his boyhood at school in Ireland and England, his time in America, and then his time in Japan, and all his wonderful writings. And it's a painless learning because you don't have to read through tomes of literature. You just read storyboards and look at the plants and look at the interesting buildings, and you're carried into different cultures.
Now, you've done many things with these gardens. You've had many visitors, choirs have sang there, dignitaries have visited, many, many Japanese people have been there, including ambassadors and everything. And it's been a huge success.
Princesses.
And princesses, exactly. It's a beautiful place. I've been out there many times myself. And of course, you do so much at Christmas and New Year's Eve as well. But the thing that's happening on Friday is the launch of the first ever Irish language translation of Lafcadio Hearn's folklore. And I suppose this is the ultimate marriage of Hearn's life in Japan and Hearn's life in Ireland, isn't it?
It's very interesting. It's very interesting how this has come about. There's a whole circle of life actually has been closed at least twice in the course of this book. It's a Japanese woman called Yunko Okura who lives in Derry and married to an Irishman. It's her idea to have this book of Irish translations of Hearn. It's the first time ever his rendition of Japanese ghost stories and folk stories. The first time it's translated into Irish. It's interesting. It's a Japanese woman who's behind it. She got funding from the British Arts Council because her group is Derry based, although they're cross-border. And this book was done based on Hearn's stories that were already written and in existence in Japan. And so we have an Irish-English translation. And the pages are juxtaposed, so you can easily look at the Irish, and if you're not sure of it, find the English on the other page. It's a lovely, beautifully illustrated book, illustrated by the daughter of Yunko, who is Claire Okoro McCoy. And so we have that group coming from Derry for the launch on Friday. The book has been launched, I should say, in Japan and also in the north. So we are the southern launch of the book.
It's great. Like I said, it's just such a lovely union of everything and everything that I suppose Lafcadio Hearn represents. Pádraig Mac Ciaráin is the translator.
He's the translator, and he will be along also, and he will explain a little bit to the audience about some of the difficulties of translating the somewhat archaic English that Hearn used into modern Irish. A very interesting thing for him and for the people from Conradh na Gaeilge who will be there will be to see the enactment on Friday in Tramore by the school children of the Tramore Gaelscoil. They are going to enact one of the stories in the book. They've picked it out themselves. It's a story about a tsunami. It's about a village elder in Japan who is standing on top of a hill. He's looking down at a beach. He's watching the tide beginning to draw out, and he hears the earth rumbling, and he's the only one who knows this means a tsunami. He warns the village about it by getting his little grandson to put on fire all the rice crop that's been saved on top of the hill. So they all rush up to save the rice. They don't know the tsunami is coming, and then it thunders in behind them, and they're all saved.
Wow.
So the children have decided to do this. They're acting it out. Their wonderful teacher is Katrina Nicorine. She's going to read out the story, and the kids will act it and run up the hill, and the tsunami imaginary coming behind them. So this is actually a really good example of how this book and the dramatic events in it can be used to instill interest in children and adults in the Irish language, myself included, not having spoken it for many years. I'm there at the rehearsals and following and so on.
And the book itself, like we said, it's beautiful to look at. I have a copy of it here in front of me. Where is this book available? Will there be copies of it available on Friday at the launch?
Yes.
And going forward then, where is it available?
Yes. It's been published by Cush Came. It will be available at the launch. We're selling it in our bookshop, and we will continue to sell it. I'm sure there will be many outlets, and the big bookshops will probably stock it like Eason's. I suspect more copies will be sold in our gardens in Tramore than anywhere else, because when visitors have gone through the gardens, and they often come back to our office and say, where can we buy his work? And we will have this lovely book then in Irish and English. And there's not a lot of books about Hearn that are available contemporaneously. You can buy old ones, you can buy them online, they cost a bit and so on, and they're available in libraries, but this one will be available in the bookshop.
And I think it would be lovely in schools as well.
Absolutely.
And who was Sayonara? Who's the title?
That's just the name of one of the stories. It's the Japanese for goodbye. Goodbye.
Okay,
yeah.
okay. It goes to show how little I know, but I suppose that's what this book is about. It's about learning for people who don't know anything about Japanese or Japanese folklore. How are the gardens going in general? Are you getting good visitor numbers, Agnes?
Yes, thankfully going very well. Thanks to the great team we have there. I can't really praise enough the people we have, the people who manage the garden in two ways. We have two management teams. We have the physical garden that has to be developed, and we have new buildings going up. We have a wonderful tea house being built. We have other work like a Japanese garden pavilion finished last year by our own staff with amazing skills. So that's been done by them, and that adds hugely to the visitor interest. And then we have the actual marketing to the public of the gardens and the interaction with media and with all the promotional stands around the country and so on. And people like Janet Carey, then our marketing manager, she's just busy all the time thinking of new uses for the gardens. And because we're not beside a huge centre of population, we have to work hard to get the business. If we were on the edge of Dublin, I think we'd have 100,000 visitors a year, but we're not. We're in Tramore, on the edge of Waterford. So we're developing ourselves now as a location for family events, for weddings and christenings and naming ceremonies and other family events. Sure. And of course school tours.
Yeah, it's really good for kids, I think. Now, before we kind of give out the details again of the launch, because I know people will want to head along, and I presume all are welcome. Lafcadio Hearn himself, like his work had a huge impact and continues to have a huge impact. And you just wanted to stress that point that he's an important writer.
He's a very important figure, and he was neglected for a while after the Second World War in particular. His name sort of faded because he was, after all, writing about Japan, and there had been this enormous war, and Japan had been a very hard enemy, and there were a lot of bad stories about the brutality in Japan against prisoners of war and so on. But Hearn had lived in Japan, and he had tried his best to understand the culture. And he wrote about the beautiful old romantic Japan and all the folklore of Japan. And he did two terribly important things in his work, totally different. The first one was he really resurrected the Japanese folklore tradition that was beginning to be dismissed by the new regime. And he kept it alive, he wrote about it, he translated it and then wrote in beautiful English and made his own of the renditions. So much so that many Japanese scholars today will acknowledge and thank him for saving their oral tradition. And that's really important. He had a love of folklore because of being Irish, which he acknowledged in a letter to William Butler Yeats. And they had a small correspondence that we know about. Maybe there was more. But Hearn was fascinated by folklore. He had a nanny from Connacht, and he credits her with giving him that interest. So that was one aspect, his writing about Japanese folklore. And that sort of thing is taught in Japanese schools today, and it's part of their curriculum. But the other part of his work that's not much known about, that had a huge impact, was his work influenced the way Japan was dealt with after World War II. When General MacArthur, the American general who came in to settle Japan, and all his troops came in and Japan was occupied, and the whole story at the time, the whole big international debate was how to treat war criminals. And there were trials and tribunals in Germany and Japan. In Japan, the issue was, how would the emperor be treated? Was the emperor a war criminal? And there was a big movement in the US that he would be treated as such. But the main advisor to General MacArthur, who was Bonner Fellers, his intelligence advisor, knew of Hearn and had read about his work. And on the basis of that, he said to him, his strong advice was not to touch the emperor, that if he did, it would be akin to killing a godhead, and that 7 million soldiers who had come back from the war and were unattached to anybody would be without anybody to guide them, and Japan might become chaotic and never be capable of being settled. And it was decided, all these letters and memoranda are there and available, and it was decided that the emperor would not be tried, and he wasn't. And Japan held together, and the Americans brought a new constitution in, and the country held together peacefully. Now, Hearn was dead at this stage. He had died in 1904, but it was his work called Japan, an Interpretation, that Fellers had read and that so influenced him. So it's really interesting that he had that
kind of influence.
A huge influence.
Yeah.
I mean, the monarchy in Japan, the chrysanthemum throne, the longest monarchy in the world, they were recently just celebrating their new emperor. All that could well have been gone had it not been for Hearn's advice as to what the consequences would be. And you could look at that sort of thing, say, in comparison, the intelligence they had there compared to the lack of similar type of intelligence in modern wars like in Iraq, where nobody understands what's going to happen if certain actions are taken, and they're not ready to deal with the chaos afterwards because there's not an understanding of the culture. So Hearn contributed that.
Excellent. We're bang out of time. It's all super interesting. I always say to people I could talk all day, but have to move on. But do want to give out the details again. It's the launch of Sayonara, the first ever Irish language translation of Lafcadio Hearn's Japanese folklore. It's a beautiful book. It is going to be launched at 2:00 on Friday the 14th of June at the Lafcadio Hearn Gardens in Tramore. And the guest speaker will be Professor Mary Gallagher from UCD. There will be a performance of Tsunami and Irish haiku by children of 5th class in the Gaelscoil in Tramore. And Fabian Flynn is the harpist there as well. Director of the whole project, Agnes Aylward, along with your team. Well done and thanks a million.